right, today we're going to look at the Gospels as a literary genre, and we will find that they are, what is true of them is true of the New Testament in general, and that is that they are a genre that is emphasizing encounters, personal encounters, and even confrontations. And that is what we find through the form of dialogue and story and sometimes explicit confrontation. People are actually confronting Jesus, or Jesus is confronting one of his, whoever he's speaking to, whether an individual or a crowd. But there's lots of face-to-face dialogues in it. And Jesus is the main person involved in the confrontation in each case. And by virtue of that, there is also a sense in which the reader is being confronted with Jesus. So Jesus is confronting those to whom he is directly speaking, whom he can see, but we can't see. We have it recorded in the Gospels. And at the same time, because of the religious and didactic purpose of the text, we, the reader, are also being confronted. We are encountering Jesus. And this makes them unique. We don't find that same sort of sense in other narratives where it's third party, third person. Here we have God speaking directly here. And there's an element of realism about it and simplicity. So last time I spoke about the literary nature of the New Testament. This seems to contradict it insofar as it's not conspicuous, the literary features, other than when we get to things like the parables, and other than what we see as features at the beginning and the ends of the Gospels, like in the genealogy of Matthew, where it's very artistic in its presentation. We have, as it says here, Matthew 1:17, all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, from David until the captivity in Babylon are 14 generations, and from the captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations. Very clear pattern and repeated 3 times. Number 7 is of symbolic significance throughout Scripture, the number of earthly completion, number of creation, doubled and then multiplied 3 times. And in that narrative, there are obviously other features. This is very artistic in its representation of genealogy. Genealogy, which is a historic genre, so it's recording generations historically, and yet here we can see that there's a plan and a pattern to it. And those that are represented in it are also descending back from Abraham, the man of faith. And by implication, Jesus himself is the man of faith. We'll find a different genealogy in Luke chapter 3, which goes back to Adam. Different purpose there then. So yes, we have genealogies, which are a historic genre, recording, showing us that history is the venue of God's providence. At the same time, here something more is being said by the genealogy than just this happened and then this happened, this person lived and then this person did. There's a purpose and a meaning to all this. So there's a simplicity and a realism about it, and yet the simplicity is majestic. There is a sense of high design in all of this. Eric Auerbach, whom I quoted earlier, his work Mimesis, says that it is a world which is entirely real, average, identifiable as to place, time, and circumstances. So that's the realism of it. And yet, as I say, the sense of historic providential design pulls it into the supernatural realm that we saw was characteristic of the Old Testament as well. And that will be reinforced when we come to see the miracles being presented in Scripture, the first of which is the birth of Christ himself. And much of it seems written in popular or folk literature. And it does, of course, presuppose knowledge of the Old Testament. So there's a great quote by Fry, and I think I've already cited it, but in case I haven't, I'll repeat. He says that the New Testament references to the Old extend over every book, not impossibly every passage in the New Testament, and some New Testament books are a dense mass of such allusions, often with direct or oblique quotations. The New Testament claims to be, among other things, the key to the Old Testament, the explanation of what the Old Testament really means. So as I say, it has this pattern of the Old Testament being a promise and the New Testament being a fulfillment of that promise, or a clarification of intent. If it was uncertain what was being pointed to in the Old Testament, there's references to future kings, future kingdoms, future fulfillments, where the seed will crush the head of the serpent. These are all fulfilled when we hit the New Testament, and it's clarified. The seed of the woman was not a reference to the first child of Eve, but rather a descendant who would be like Adam and yet without sin, and hence the stories of his birth and the peculiarities of it. So then when we come to the Gospels themselves, we can see that they are unique. Although the claim, I addressed this last time, that they are incomparable to any other genres is overstated. There are features in the Gospels that allow us to compare them to other genres. And that's what demonstrates the uniqueness. This is the thing I always say in my classes about claims of originality and uniqueness, for that matter. You can't know that something is unique or original except insofar as you compare it to things that go before it. And when we do that, we can see that there are features of even the gospel accounts that we will find elsewhere in other literary texts of the period. And that's what allows some people to say that they're just continuations of the same sorts of things. But I addressed that last time. As far as their uniqueness, well, one of the unique features is that they're encyclopedic as forms. They seem to include all manner of forms, some of which we saw in our discussion of the Old Testament. So it includes hero story, it includes folk story, it contains wisdom, it contains parables, it contains high drama, it contains tragedy, it contains song, or encomium, there's praise in it. So they are encyclopedic as forms. They include the A to Z of different types of literary genres there. And it is the precise combination of these literary elements that converge in them that is without precise parallel outside the Bible. That is Ryken's observation, and I agree. There's no exact parallel outside the Bible to what we have here. So it is unique in that sense. But unique not as in it is of its own genre, but rather it contains them all. So it's like, to some degree, what an epic does, and what Milton does with his epic in Paradise Lost. He throws some tragedy in there. In Book 9, he talks about the fall of mankind told there as being a sort of mini tragedy within the epic. The Gospels are even more comprehensive than Milton's epic. So what sort of genres? I listed some of them. So we have historical narrative, we have parable, we have drama, we have dialogue, we have sermons, or orations, if you prefer. We have proverbs. We clearly have a biography of sorts. We have journalistic account at the beginning of Luke's and the end of Luke's gospel. We have tragedy, we have comedy, and we have satire. Jesus satirizes. We've already looked at that in his encounter with the Pharisees. And of course we have poetry. But we do see there's no dominant genre. It's not just narrative, it's not just poetry. It seems to be equally balanced in some sense. So then let's look at the question of how literary the Gospels are. I talked about the New Testament as a whole last time. How about the Gospels in particular? Well, one thing that everyone, when they come to read the Gospel accounts, notes is that they really vividly appeal to our imaginations. The stories are arresting. They draw you in. They're extraordinarily ably written. And they bring us to effectively recreate the whole experience. So people remember the stories in Scripture that they were taught when they were children. And I'm speaking now of people I know who no longer go to church but did when they were younger. I'm talking about older people now. It doesn't happen so much because people don't. In Canadian society, as a rule, go to church because it's just the thing you do. That's no longer the case in Canada. But for those who did, I've noted that they remember their stories from Scripture. And I think that part of it is just that the stories are vivid and memorable. Although it does proclaim the truth, it doesn't purport to be objective, as in neutral in its presentation. It never tries to present it as if there was not a purpose there. The purpose is there to bring you to faith in Christ. That's explicit. And the point of view is tilted that way as well. So if you think you can read it and stand back from it and make a judgment on the basis of the facts that you're reading about, you're going to find that the text frustrates you. Because it is explicitly interpreting the events that have happened. Sometimes from different points of view. Narrative certainly is the primary form, there's no doubt, but again, it conjoins all of the other genres I talked about already. The stories that we're told are highly artistic. That there's a pattern to them, there's a unity to them, and a balance and a symmetry. They use foils, so there can be 2 sons or 3 sowers, so sort of dramatic features to allow us to make contrasts between the wicked and the wise, and the righteous and the unrighteous, and so forth. Lots of repetition, lots of dramatic foreshadowing, and echoes of other passages in Scriptures, and we already talked about the use of the Old Testament, so allusions to passages that the writers assume that we know, and if we don't know them, we are, to some degree, by virtue of the reference to this, sometimes it explicitly says, as it says in the psalm, as the psalmist says, or something like that, or as Isaiah says, but sometimes it quotes without giving you the footnote. You just have to find it yourself, but it's clear that it's citing something. So narrative, as I say, is the primary form. It's not discourse or saying. Now, the reason I say that is because there's something in New Testament circles called the Jesus Seminar. Have you heard of this? The Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar, I don't know when this came into existence, but a few decades ago, sort of like the quest for the historical Jesus, that has tried to find behind the texts that we have in the Gospels the original sayings of Jesus. So there's a text behind the text. What did Jesus really say? And in general, what it does is it takes different dialogues from the different gospel accounts and notes the incongruities there between them, and then tries to find, well, what was the original story behind the variances in the stories there? Ignoring the fact that Jesus can tell the same story to a different crowd on different occasions. I mean, they're not just citing the one time he spoke, and they're getting it wrong. Some of them are saying it a little differently and so forth. That's as if that weren't possible. I mean, I teach this class, and every time I teach it, the material is roughly the same, but I imagine the wording is slightly different because I'm not following a script verbatim. And I can imagine as a teacher that Jesus did the same thing. He would tell a story, and it would be slightly different and a different context.
Did you say that was called, sorry?
The Jesus Seminar. The Jesus Seminar is a number of biblical studies scholars who are trying to find the original statements of Jesus behind the statements that he has said. Now, what the Jesus Seminar does is it eliminates references to things like miracles. And it also eliminates references to the Old Testament. Those are said to have been put in there by a later editor. And we end up getting, as the account of what Jesus said, to be a very small body of text. And then they agree on it or disagree on it. I think they have a card system. Who thinks this is the case? Pull up your card if it's this, and you end up with a very small body of text that Jesus actually said. So it's taking the written text and taking it back to a verbal text, with the understanding that oral societies precede written societies, which may be true, except that in the time of the New Testament, those that are writing are Jewish, and they're highly literate. Even I spoke to this when I talked about the view of the New Testament as being written by illiterate fishermen, and hence the Koine Greek, and hence the lack of literary features, except that it has a lot of literary features, and they most likely were almost certainly were not illiterate. They would have been taught to read and write because they were Jewish, and they understood that this is the Word of God. This is Second Temple Judaism. These are not cavemen or fishermen with no education. They have been taught in synagogues. They've received a formal education. And so the Jesus Seminar, trying to get to the original speeches of Jesus that were later written up, according to them, is presuming that that's how this was delivered, when anyone who's studied the period knows that this, that, as I say, literacy in the time of the New Testament writing amongst the Jewish community was higher than it is today. Higher, not lower. Particularly among the men. So the fishermen, the illiterate fishermen, were exactly the opposite. And Jesus likewise. He read from the scroll. Right, in the temple on his bar mitzvah, he opened up, it was in Isaiah, and said, today this has been fulfilled in your eyes. Right? Same with his audience in the synagogue, same with Peter, Paul, John, etc. These are men who are literate, and they're not, and you don't need to find the sayings. The sayings are preserved in the text. This is the original text. You don't have to go to a source that precedes it. That's based on a certain presupposition about cultures in that day, which are that they are fundamentally illiterate. And later writers in a more literate generation have written them up, and therefore we don't know what actually Jesus ever said. And we don't know who Jesus was. This is again called the quest for the historical Jesus. It's part of 19th century biblical scholarship. And what it does as a premise is states that we can't trust the written word. because we need to get behind that to the verbal articulations of Jesus, and how are we going to get to that? Well, through a reductionistic hermeneutic. So I note that narrative is the primary form here, and it's not discourses or sayings, although we do get some sayings from Jesus, and we do get his discourses, his interacting with his audience, whoever they are. And note that the stories as they're presented are episodic. They're not unified like the stories of, to a lesser degree, let's say Abraham, which we looked at, where we do get an episode in an episode, but there's a sense of a narrative thread there. In the Gospels, there's less unity in that sense. They seem more random. Whereas in Abraham, there are accounts of, yes, Abraham's interactions with others, but there's a thread of narrative that connects them all together. So you can see a progression of Abraham's character. We don't get that same sense with Jesus. Jesus is a fully formed character. He's not learning as he goes. He seems to be the master from the beginning, and he's masterful till the end. He starts teaching at 30, we know that. But he hasn't got lessons to learn. Abraham has lessons to learn, and he learns them in the story of Abraham's life. Jesus, not so. And the apparent randomness of the episodes portrays Jesus in many different roles. And in each of the roles, he is the master. Even in his passion, in his suffering. Because the crowd wants to, at points, and certainly the Pharisees, they want to kill him. Sometimes the crowd rushes at him, and he evades them. He goes through them. His time has not yet come. He's the master in every situation. Sometimes he's the teacher. Sometimes he is the social critic, like in his satire, or the prophet. Sometimes he is the king riding on a donkey. Sometimes he's the suffering servant. But in each of these roles, and they are sort of roles, there's a unity in him. He's the unifying feature, but he wears different hats, if you will. Now he's got the prophet's hat on, now he has the king's hat on, now he has the teacher's hat on. So manifold roles here. But the unity is again in his person. In the person of Jesus, the man is God in all of these various human roles. So let's look at the topic of the unity in the Gospels. The unity, of course, we have 4 Gospels. It's a sort of an interesting feature. Again, this is unique. If it's a biography, why do we have 4 biographies? And moreover, 4 authoritative biographies. You know, the famous people today, they sometimes get biographies written about them, and usually when these start to proliferate because the person is of such public interest, the person concerned will want to authorize one of them and say, okay, this is the one who I have made sure tells the story the way I want it to be told. And so this is the authorized biography of the king, the queen, whoever, the pop star. Maybe there's some royalties that go along with that, so they get a cut out of the biography. Here we have 4 biographies, and all of them are authorized, and yet they're different in certain respects, and yet they're unified in other respects. So let's talk about the points of unity. The main point of unity is the hero, speaking from a literary vantage point. We have a hero in the story, and that's Jesus. And everything in these 4 accounts focuses on his person, so his birth and his death, his acts, the miracles he performs, the encounters he has with people, and in his sayings. Now, I said that these are biographies, and normally biographies, although not always, normally biographies are written chronologically. So you start with a birth, and you end with a death. But not all of these four Gospels actually tell the account of Jesus' birth. At least as we would recognize it. So John's Gospel does not talk about Jesus' birth. It talks about his biography in a cosmic fashion. In the beginning, right, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with him in the beginning. It talks about creation, so it goes all the way back to Genesis then, and it's clearly echoing that. And every reader who's read the Genesis 1 is reminded in the language of John of the language of Genesis. So it is a biography of sorts, but now the person is being more strongly identified with God than in the other narratives where he's strongly identified with being a man born of a woman. Not so there in John's Gospel. But of course, in both cases, they're saying the same thing. So there's a unity of the hero. The hero is a man of a unique virgin birth, but this man is God, the Creator. So the general pattern, not true in John's Gospel, as I say, but the general pattern is a movement from Jesus' birth, recorded only in Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, so only two of the four. Surprises people when they, most people know the Christmas story. They associate the Christmas story, of course, with the birth of Jesus. They may go to a church, they may have read Charlie Brown or watched Charlie Brown. They know about the circumstances there. There's a lot of, the wise men and the shepherds, lots of, in the creche, and you have little Christmas pageants and so forth associated with the birth. But only two of the gospel accounts talk about that. Shocking. You expect it to be there in all of them. But it's only there in those two, and his 3-year earthly ministry is the primary note of record. So this is a funny old biography. So two of the four refer to his birth, only two, and all of them ignore almost entirely 30 years of his life, because they deal with the last 3 years of his life, which is when he goes and becomes a public figure. He starts preaching the gospel. So it's a funny biography in that sense. We'll give the account of the birth. We'll give one account of something that happens in year 12, which is when he, on his bar mitzvah, his coming of age, he's now a man, he reads from the scroll, and then he disappears for 18 years. We don't know anything about what he did. We know that he was at home. He was a carpenter, so he worked. And he lived with his parents. A bachelor. A lot of jokes about that in Jewish circles. But the primary feature is his death. So again, if you're telling a biographical account, you will always, any other biography is going to talk about the education of the child, the influences, what was going on in his day. There's no interest in that whatsoever in the gospel accounts. No interest at all. It is only interested in him, but it doesn't talk about almost 30 years of his life. The birth, yes, there's one incident, year 12. His parents take him to Egypt to flee being killed. We know about that. But other than that, zero. So 30 years of silence about the most important figure in human history. In his biography, nothing there. And then we get the 3 years of his teaching ministry, but those 3 years are all pointing towards the end of his teaching ministry, which is his death. So the cross and it looms large over the entire account. And I think 2/3 of the written Gospels deal with the last week of his life. I might be wrong about the number there, but I'd say half, at least half. So an extraordinary account. If it's a biography, it is unique in that sense, clearly. It's placing all the emphasis on the end of the figure. This is the climax of the story. And it doesn't surprise you because he predicts what's going to happen, even though everyone else, including, or in particular his disciples, refuse to believe it. So this is the broad chronological framework. Within that, the four gospel writers arrange the material, and they arrange it. Now, so as I say, the stories, so the Matthew, Mark, and Luke are roughly the same, tell roughly the same story from roughly the same point of view. So these are called the synoptic gospels. They have the same viewpoint. And they have, to some degree, the same story. So they're not wholly. There are some differences, and sometimes they're arranged in different order, which again leads some people to discount them as recording events that actually happened. They've garbled them, they've got them wrong. But the arrangement, this is a Bible as literature class, let's talk about the arrangement. The arrangement is there to fit specific thematic and narrative purposes. That's why they're arranged the way they are. I say Mark's gospel is in a hurry to get to the crux of the matter, so he just drops the birth narrative altogether. Matthew and Mark record a day of teaching in parables, but Mark puts it right at the beginning of his story, so chapter 4, whereas Matthew places it in chapter 13. So they just flip it around. So I can illustrate if you want. So temptation in the wilderness, I'll skip over that, but then he begins his teaching ministry. So this is Matthew. Okay? Whereas, oh, sorry. I've got this wrong. It's Mark that I wanted here. That account of the temptation in the wilderness comes earlier in Mark's account, comes right at the beginning, in chapter 2. But let me go to this. Mark, it's Mark 4 I want here. Parables. So there's a day of teaching in parables. It's right here in Mark 4, parable of the sower, purpose of the parables, parable of the sower explained, etc. If we go to Matthew 14, we'll find, or 13 rather, we get the same thing. Parable of the sower, purpose of the parables, parable of the sower explained, etc. Same episode, thrown into a different area of the account. How come? Well, that takes time. You need to see it in the context of everything that's written before, but we simply notice that the order is significantly different. Likewise, certain events in Jesus' life appear in different places in the Gospels. So, for example, for John, the cleansing of the temple comes near the beginning of the whole story. So it's in John chapter 2. Remember, John is very different than the others. Turns the water to wine, and he cleanses the temple. This is John 2. But in the other three gospel accounts, it's right near the end of the book during the week of the Passion Week. It's right at the end, right before he's about to be crucified, he's going to cleanse the temple, and the cleansing of the temple is related to his crucifixion. Here it's related to his whole ministry in John's gospel right at the beginning. So it's pulled towards John pulls it towards the beginning, the others push it towards the end. In both cases, the cleansing of the temple is very important. Now this is Reichen's comment. I already talked about the quest for the historical Jesus, or the Jesus seminar. He comments, he says, the arrangement of material in the Gospels will seem more unified if we pause to consider that it reflects how the memory recalls events. Memory was important in the composition of the Gospels, which no doubt represent the final molding of material that first circulated orally in the form of individual units. I think he's speculating there. And that it was originally oral. Well, of course it was oral in one sense. Yes, of course. But we have no record of that. We have the written accounts. And we have only the record accounts, the written accounts, and they're the only thing that we know about it. They're the authoritative thing. There is, by definition, no record of an oral account. Right? As soon as it was written down, then it's no longer oral. So that he asked the question, how does the memory work? It recalls broad outlines. That's how. It remembers single incidents, and it strings together certain sequences of events. That's true. If you're trying to record something that happened in your life, you think about the broad context and the framework of it, and then very specific individual events. And then he said this, and who was there? These people were there, and it happened at this point and so forth, and that's how these things happen. So the principle of memory is what structures things. Both John's gospel, which puts the cleansing of the temple at the beginning, and the other three gospels, which put it towards the end, are seeing the clear and important significance of the cleansing of the temple. It's a religious purification. And remember, the temple is also a reference to the body of Jesus. Destroy this temple, and I'll raise it in 3 days. They think he's referring to the place. He's referring to his own body. But the temple is actually a symbol of his body. That's picked up on in the book of Hebrews. A lot of discussion of that in Hebrews 9. The temple. Also in Paul's Gospels, he talks about the body as a temple. And we being stones in that temple in Corinthians and so forth, stones being built in the temple of the body of which is Jesus. How are we living stones, in fact? But there's further unity in what I called earlier type scenes or recurrent situations. And Jesus is always the central figure. So, and some of them I mentioned last time, the woman at the well. This is where marriages begin. So Jesus is the most important figure in the type scenes. The second most important are the disciples. But almost as prominent are the Pharisees, so his opponents, the religious teachers, who are almost without exception hostile. At very best, they're appearing friendly and disguising their hostility. We also find that there's a crowd that follows him around, an ordinary crowd of people, often nameless. And occasionally there's a representative that comes out and speaks from the crowd. The crowds are really interesting as a study on themselves, because they seem to be torn between Jesus, whom they really like, and the religious leaders, the Pharisees, who they want to follow. But Jesus is not allowing them to follow both of them. You have to go one way or the other. And the crowd really likes him and they're following him, and the Pharisees are jealous of this and angry about it, in fact. They're threatened by this fact that he appeals to the crowds. And the crowd represents, to some degree, the reader. We're being forced into a decision. And we usually get them depicted as on the moment of decision. Jesus is usually trying to persuade them. He does it sometimes through his teaching, sometimes he does it through miracles, which John calls signs. They point to something, the signs are there. So it's not just a story, but it's a pointed story. It's a story with a direction. And so we can see, given the centrality of the crowd in that, why there is a conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees, because both claim to be religious leaders, and their claims contradict one another. Which brings to light the importance of teaching in the gospel accounts, as in the New Testament as a whole. So characters are a point of unity. So Jesus as the hero, the framework of the whole accounts is a point of unity. The type scenes are a point of unity, or the recurrent situations. The crowd of characters that we see, Jesus, the disciples, the Pharisees, the crowd. Likewise, the geography. Lots of place names here. Sometimes it serves a structural purpose. So in Mark's gospel, there's the place of Galilee, which is where Jesus is accepted, and Jerusalem, the place where he's rejected. And there's an irony there, because it should be the other way around. Galilee is a long way away from the center of Jewish religious life. It's in the hinterlands. He ought to be accepted in Jerusalem. But he's rejected there. Okay, let's look at the individual episodes. Well, there's a point of unity there as well. When we're looking at individual episodes, we want to ask the same sorts of questions that we would of any narrative text, which is, what's the setting? Who are the characters? What's the plot? So where is it? Who's there? What happens? And the most common sort of theme here is conflict. This is also why the stories are compelling. So we like conflict. It's interesting. And the conflict is moving towards resolution. There's a resolution in the conflict. And there's always a winner, by the way, and it's always Jesus, which also makes him heroic, of course. He wins until he loses. And when he loses hugely. Except that he wins when he loses, because that was the aim all along, and he brings about and orchestrates that outcome. He came to do that. So the point at which his enemies finally triumph is the point at which they utterly fail. And so there's a heroism in the continual victories, but it's most pronounced in the defeat, which is a sort of victory because it's a victory over the things that don't characterize Jesus but characterize us, namely the sin and death which Jesus has come to take care of, and the rebellion against God, which God himself is going to rectify through obedience. So there's a trajectory of resolution or even of epiphany. So when Jesus meets the woman at the well, she suddenly sees something she hadn't seen before. It dawns on her. I've talked about the woman at the well already. I'm not going to spend time on it here just for time purposes. But there's so much dialogue and encounter. It's helpful to lay out the action in scenes, like in a drama. So scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. Sometimes it even almost presents itself that way. So think of it as like a play, or acts, if you will. There's an act 1, act 2, and then the third act. And that often happens that way. It's episodic, and there's an interaction, and then there's, between the acts, there seems to be something going on in the heads of the speakers, and likewise of the readers then. So there's a sequence and a positioning of scenes. Or you can think of it, and this is Ryken's suggestion, think about a television crew that's recording or photographing events, and then it moves to the next scene. So sometimes we get zoom in. Just think about films. Sometimes they zoom in on the face of the character. Sometimes they pull back and we see the crowd that's there. Or even more broadly back, we can see the geography. Right? Sometimes it zooms in, it zooms out, it picks up a snippet of the dialogue, it pulls back and moves it, and so it does that, it shifts continuously. We go from one speaker to the next speaker. We go to the crowd. How's the crowd responding to all this? And then it sometimes concludes with the narrative perspective of the writer. There can actually be a commentary on it, in the same way we saw was true of Old Testament narrative. So those are ways of unifying the text. Even more if we look at the whole narrative world then. And I'll read from Ryken here. He says that it is a literary principle, this is page 375, that works of literature create their own consistent world of interrelated details. The individual Gospels have their own characteristic ideas, images, settings, and emphasis. So, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, we move in a Jewish world where Old Testament prophecies and religious customs are consistently present. So it's very much emphasizing the Jewish context. Jesus is repeatedly portrayed in terms of royalty, more so than the others. And the teaching of Jesus is in blocks, and these blocks are interspersed between sections of narrative. So there's a narrative, and then there's a teaching block, and a narrative, and a teaching block. Luke's Gospel, on the other hand, has a very different narrative world. It's written by a doctor, probably a Gentile. And this is very much of a cosmopolitan world. So the one's very much of a Jewish world, the other's more cosmopolitan. It's Jewish, but also the Greco-speaking Roman world coming in conflict with it. And we see people on the social and religious fringes being depicted in Luke's Gospel, not so much in Matthew. Matthew is looking at the Jews and the Jewish community. Luke's Gospel looks at a cosmopolitan, very multicultural, and looks at the margins. It looks at women in Luke's Gospel, it looks at the poor, it looks at outsiders, and sometimes people who are very shady, tax collectors, thieves, etc. And those are the ones who receive God's grace. So you go from, in a sense, what we see in the book of Acts. It begins in Jerusalem, and then it spreads out to Judea, and then it goes to the ends of the earth. Matthew begins in Jerusalem, or at least in the Jewish, and then in the other Gospels it pushes in the direction of the cultures that are around that and are influenced by it. So it pulls that in. But in each case, knowing that the individual gospel writers build their own world in this way helps us to unify the various four accounts. How about the portrait of Jesus then? It's actually a very interesting topic in some ways. The language of portrait is a visual, right? And in Western art, there are depictions of Jesus, visual depictions of Jesus. In iconography, it's not realistic, the aim of the painting. You don't get anyone that actually looks like the icons. It's a peculiar angle. So you will not meet somebody that looks like the Jesus portrayed in icons, and that's intentional, by the way. But it's all speculative because we actually have no physical description of Jesus whatsoever. Nothing. We know that he was a man. We know that he is born in that area we call Israel, Palestine. And so presumably he looked Palestinian. Dark hair, curly hair probably. Skin more olive than white. He certainly doesn't look like me. He doesn't look like a Dutch painting either. He doesn't have blonde hair, blue eyes. He doesn't look like an Italian in Renaissance painting. I have no objections to either of the portraits, by the way, but we will just say that they're appealing to the standards and the people that they're painting to in both cases. The portrait of Jesus is not a portrait of his appearance, it's a portrait of his message. And a message is something that you hear, not that you see. And so there's something that's important about not being given a physical description of Jesus, which pushes us in the direction of the word again and how the word works. And the word, we've already seen from the word devar, is a speech, but also an action. When God speaks, he acts. When Jesus speaks, he acts. He teaches and he also acts. He does it through miracles, but the miracles are demonstrating what he's already saying. So there's a symmetry there, and there's a consonance of purpose in that. And again, it is against the idea of a portrait as something that you see. In fact, it's not something that you see. It's something that you hear and you believe. And it's a strong emphasis in Scripture. Sometimes they go on at great length about blessed are those who hear and have not seen. Remember, Thomas wants to stick his fingers in Jesus' side and in his hands. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe, but they've heard. So what is this? When we're talking about the life and message of Jesus, we can misinterpret what they mean. And there are three theories Ryken mentions here on this purpose. How do we compare the portrait of Jesus? Well, we could look at it as a photograph. That's one way of seeing a portrait. We could look at it as a painted portrait. Or we could even look at it as an abstract painting. So two different types of painting. So one's a photograph, forensic in its detail, minutiae being described. The other is a artistic representation of painting, and the artistry could either be realistic or abstract, like a Picasso. If we look at it as a photograph, it records everything about a subject and it's objective. There's no room for interpretation there, really. Like the photograph captures everything that it shows. I guess you could, photographers may beg to differ, and good photographers will do something with it. You can blur things a little bit. You can bring things into the foreground. A little bit of that, but it's pretty neutral, and there's not a lot of interpretation happening there. And that is its limitation. There's not much room for interpretation. Now, Christians, when they want to talk about the truth of the gospel accounts, are going to want to push it in the direction of photograph, because that appears to be objective, true, real, and fit with the criteria of the Enlightenment, that there's no interpretation going on, right? It's just truth. It's narrative, historical truth being recorded. The problem is that that's not how the Gospels are actually written. It's not, we don't have a photograph here. And when I say it's a problem, it's not really a problem. The problem is the demand that that's how truth presents itself to us. The way that the Enlightenment demands. The Enlightenment needs to recalibrate its expectations, or those who want to see the truth need to understand it happens differently. Let's look at the second type, a painted portrait. Well, it's selective in its details. It highlights certain things and it omits other things. So that fits better. An abstract painting, on the other hand, is really vague in its portrait, and it really depends on impressionistic details and broad outlines. If you look at a Picasso painting, it takes you a while to figure out what's even being portrayed there. In fact, you usually need the text down below in the later Picasso to know what on earth is being portrayed here. So I don't think it's an abstract painting. We're given portraits. They're not photographs. Again, that's the pressure of the scientific era demanding objective accounts that we can see and from a neutral perspective come to the exact same conclusions. I think we don't have that here. Reichen quotes one scholar and says, one way of looking at it is as a television sports replay. I'll quote. These actually occurred if one is given the full treatment, close-up, slow action, forward and reverse, split screen, the same scene from several perspectives and with verbal commentary and interpretation of an expert superimposed, one has a fair analogy of what the evangelists do. One might add to the significance of the analogy by pointing out that the true significance of certain plays can only be known after the game is over. Was this the TSN turning point? Right, there's a key play, and the ball is bouncing in the air, and he caught it, it was inbounds, and that changed the game. Well, you don't know it until it's all over that was the case. I don't know. If it helps you to see it that way, okay. At least it's showing that even like when you watch the televised sport, you will find that the sport happens, but because of the technology, they can focus in on the goals, the touchdowns, the whatever, and the lead up to it and certain key events. And so they're already interpreting what's happening. They're bringing into focus the most important events of the whole game. That is what is, to some degree, is happening in the gospel accounts. Except that we're not given the whole game. As I say, we're only given certain features of the game. So even that is interpretative. How about style? Style is like the Old Testament narrative, but even more strongly so. It's laconic, it's brief, it's to the point. There's a lot packed into a very short space of time. The dominant emphasis is realism. There's an inclusion of dialogue within that, which brings excitement and dramatic techniques, but it's a very simple style. by and large. And if you try writing a story, you will find how brilliant the accounts here are. The brevity and the appeal of the accounts is extraordinary. It's very hard to tell a story in such short detail with such power. And that depends not only what you say, but what you don't say. To be brief, you can't tell everything. This is a very difficult skill to master. Students find it particularly difficult. It's to focus. To focus, you can't say everything. You have to, if you're going to really make something compelling, you can't go on at great length. You have to get to the point. You have to first of all figure out what's the point of the story. And when you figure out the point of the story, the point of the story is the meaning of the story. How do I bring out the meaning of the story when I tell the story? What is the central focus? And then I will pivot everything around that theme. And I can't complicate things because I will lose people if I do that. I have to make my point, and it has to be right there. And a child will understand it. It has to be vivid and simple. And that makes them, although they appear simple, very complex. It's hard to be brief and profound. It really is. That was characteristic of Proverbs. Memorable, profound, and brief. So very simple on the surface, very deep when you get into it. But as I say, the overall message, very easy to grasp. Stated over and over and over. Pattern of repetition. How about subtypes? Ryken wants to get into this. I'll just list some of them, the different types of accounts. I mentioned at the outset the nativity stories is one subtype, or genres. Another is the vocation stories or calling. Jesus calls people to follow him. It's one of the things that I say to my Arminian friends when they talk about choosing to follow Jesus, which is an experiential thing. Of course, there's a sense of choice. Oh, I'm going to do this. But in the gospel accounts, God chooses everyone who's going to follow him. There's a crowd that follows him around. They choose to follow Jesus. Do they believe in him? No, they follow him around though. But he does choose all of his disciples. He goes out and picks them out and says, you come with me. You. One's up in a tree. The others are fishing. And so he comes up to them and he chooses them. He identifies them. He knows them by name, picks them out and says, come on, let's go. And he does so with authority. Doesn't try and persuade them. He just says, come on, let's go. So the calling of the disciples is the prime illustration. It's not the only one. There are other senses of calling in there. But there are four basic ingredients. The person who's called. So who, the who. Who's called? It's the first. The second is the circumstances in which we find them. As I say, Peter and Andrew are fishing. Then there's somebody up in a tree. He's trying to, because he's a little guy, Zacchaeus, he's up in a tree. He gets called in a different, he's not a disciple, he gets called. He's trying to see Jesus. He can't because of the crowd. He can't see above the crowd, so he goes way up there and he says, you. The nature of the call, he doesn't just call to people, he calls them to something. He calls them to something. And so then there's the importance of responding to the call. What's the right response? What's the wrong response? Because this is emphasized, these vocation stories, these calling stories, and it's in terms of an encounter or a dialogue, when we read it, we have the same sense of calling to us, the reader. It adds, in drama, we call this the fourth wall. There's a fourth wall. Like if you think on stage, there's a wall behind it and along the sides, and then at the front of the stage, there's no wall. And the characters on the stage interact with one another as if the audience is not there, right? And they act as if here's the world going on and we get to watch it from the outside and we're not involved in the action. But if somebody comes front stage, gives a soliloquy in Shakespeare, they're not breaking through the fourth wall. They're, what Shakespeare uses a soliloquy for is to give us internal monologue. What's the character thinking? So he stands apart from the group, and now we know what Hamlet's thinking. To be or not to be, that is the question. Right? And then gives an extended speech, but it's not to the audience. It's trying to show he's thinking. You can do this in films these days by simply having the character's voice. The man sitting there looking, and you can hear his words inside of his own head. Okay, well, you can do that in film, but you can't do that in drama. In drama, you have to show that the person is thinking by speaking. Well, you pull them apart for, okay, but that's not the fourth wall. The fourth wall is when the person comes to the front of the stage and looks down at the audience and starts speaking to them, like literally, and points to them even. And so he acknowledges that the audience is there. Shakespeare doesn't acknowledge that the audience is there in general. Very rarely is the audience even acknowledged as existing. But in the fourth wall, modern theater, it does do that. It breaks through that artificial barrier that we're watching a performance, and now it's not a performance, it's life. That's what happens in the Gospels. It's implied, but there's a strong sense, since Jesus is speaking to the whole world, the crowd, we're part of the crowd that's watching. He addresses the crowd. What do you say? Who do you say I am? So that's part of the vocation story. Again, this makes it a unique genre. You don't find that in other texts of the period or until the modern stage. There are also recognition stories. It's when somebody discovers who Jesus is. A lot of plot conflict. And then epiphany, insight. You need two ingredients there. One, you need all the circumstances that lead up to the recognition. You have the occasion, you have the setting, you have the characters. And how do all these things lead to the point of recognition? The second element is, what exactly does the character recognize about Jesus? What exactly? So famous instance, I believe it's in Luke's gospel, is when Peter, who gets everything wrong, recognizes, so Jesus says, who do you say I am? So that some are saying this, but who do you say I am? Peter says, you are the Christ. You're right. First time, you're right. Now don't tell anyone. Now can you imagine that? Poor Peter, repeatedly humiliated, always wrong, gets one thing right, and then he's told not to say anything. Can you imagine like you fail. Right. I want to tell people, it's Jesus. He's the Christ. No, you cannot tell anyone. And then what happens? He talks about, okay, now I'm going to have to go. Now that you know that, and you're right, now that you know who I am, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and I'm going to get reviled, rebuked, and killed by the teachers of the law. That's when it's going to happen. And in 3 days I'll rise again. And Peter rebukes him, says that's not going to happen. And Jesus says to him, get behind me, Satan. Right? This is a bad day for Peter. He got one thing right, and then he got called Satan. And what happens in the middle of that? Well, we get a little story just thrown into the middle of it. A little story, fascinating story, of a blind man. And Jesus performs a miracle on him, but he needs 2 goes at it. It's extraordinary, the story. You know the story of the blind man? Jesus puts his hands over his eyes and heals him. And it says, what do you see? And he says, well, I see men like trees walking around. Oh, Jesus' superpowers were waning that day. He couldn't get it right. And he does it a second time, and now he can see clearly. What is that story there designed to do? It's not that Jesus couldn't have healed him with 1. It took 2 shots. It's an illustration, I think, of Peter. Peter can see men like trees walking around. He sees that Jesus is the Messiah. Yes, but he denies that he's come to die for human sin. He denies that, so he doesn't see clearly enough. So that's why he says, don't tell anyone. You don't know yet. Yes, I'm the Messiah, but the Messiah is the one who's going to have to die for your sins, and you deny that. So you don't see clearly yet, and until you do, you will shut up and not say anything. Note the narrative and the way it's structured. It's fascinating. It's telling a story within it. Now, this is part of the recognition stories. Peter recognizes that Jesus is the Christ, but he doesn't know who the Christ is or what the Christ is there to do. The Christ is the Messiah, the King. You're the King. Right. And now I'm going to go and die. No. That's not what the Messiah does. Okay. That's why you can't say anything, because that is exactly what's going to happen. So, recognition story. Then there are witness stories. These are sort of testimonies about what Jesus did or for them. 3 main ingredients. There's the witness, so the who question. There's the testimony, the what, as in what did he do. Think of Lazarus. He goes around, this man raised me from the dead. And then the why. It's the proof. Might contain the circumstances. Well, I'm walking around. Pharisees say, don't tell anyone this. This is bad news. Don't suppress that. It may not be fake news, but don't tell anyone. Everyone's going to believe you if you tell them that you rose from the dead. Don't say anything. So that's a type of story. When Jesus himself is the witness, the focus is on the testimony of others rather than the proof. Then there are encounter stories, like Zacchaeus or the Samaritan woman caught, right? There are also conflict stories or controversy stories. Jesus is always the protagonist here. Who is he confronting? Sometimes they're just people asking questions. Sometimes they are genuinely, overtly hostile. And if, in both cases, even when they're not really super hostile, they're trying to trap him in some way. And Jesus he mounts a defense and he has a countermeasure. Then we have pronouncement stories. Jesus' life is linked with a memorable saying or proverb. Then we have miracle stories. How does the miracle story work? Well, first of all, there's a need identified. We've run out of wine at the wedding. First miracle he performs in Cana. My son's about to die. You got to come. Oh, he's already dead. You got here. Oh, if he hadn't been delayed, this wouldn't have happened. So the need is established in a miracle story. Jesus' help is sought. The person in need, sometimes their acquaintances expresses faith or obedience. Jesus performs a miracle. And the characters in the story respond to the miracle, or sometimes or to Jesus directly. Sometimes one of these 5 elements is missing. And there's a fair bit of variety. Some of them are very sketchy in their outline. Some are in full detail. A great deal of detail is included. Sometimes the miracle is the focus. Sometimes it's just there to point to the purpose of the miracle, which is to reveal who Jesus is. Sometimes the miracle attests to Jesus' power. Sometimes it is a way of teaching a lesson about something else. All of these say something about what miracles actually are. Miracles we think of as supernatural events. There's a more complex view of what miracles are in the Gospels. It's not just a contradiction of expectations or, again, doing something that cannot be done. That is true of a miracle, but miracles contain far more than simply that. Because as I say, they often teach a lesson about faith, or they symbolize something else. That's the purpose of it. Or as John calls them in his gospel, they are signs. And then finally, we have the passion stories. These are the events relating to the trial and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And these are at the climax of all 4 gospels. So I said, the Gospels, only 2 of them contain the narrative of his birth, but all 4 contain the narrative of his death. Which is the more important? It's clear. Although the birth is miraculous and obviously expresses the uniqueness of this man and God's purposes being fulfilled in him, it's the death that's the downbeat. It's the emphasis. The symbol of the Christian faith is the cross. For that reason, it's not a manger scene. You don't wear a manger around your neck. You got a cross. The specificity of the detail in the passion stories characterizes the storytelling method. And Ryken notes, and this is, I'm going to conclude with this, of the 4 passion stories, if we take them together, we can subdivide them into discernible stories. What are these? Well, there's the arrival in Jerusalem. That's the first story. There's a whole bunch of scenes there related to that. There's the Passover. There's a whole series of stories related to the Passover and the upper room discourse, right? And Last Supper. There's the scene of the suffering in Gethsemane, the Garden of Gethsemane. There is the scenes of Jesus' arrest. There's the scene of Jesus' trial. There's the scenes of Jesus' crucifixion. There's the scene of Jesus' burial. There's the scene of Jesus' resurrection. There's the scene of the post-resurrection events, the 40 days between resurrection and ascension, in which Jesus teaches again, reinforces what he said before, but now they get it. And in all of these passion narratives, we find the convergence of 2 types of stories that normally we categorize as opposite, the tragedy and the comedy. The tragedy is in Good Friday, the comedy is in Easter Sunday. The catastrophic trajectory, which led some to say that the Bible is not friendly to tragic themes. I'd love to look at John's Gospel in details, but I didn't have time for that today, so we'll just leave it at that. So that's it for today, and I shall see you next time.